Julian, Captain Watson, timeframes?
Well, we're in the midst of a major extinction event. I mean, we're going to lose more species of plants and animals between 1950 and 2050 than we've lost in the last 65 million years. This is, I think, one of the deepest concerns on it. One of the problems is that no species can live on this planet outside of the basic laws of ecology. The first is the law of diversity. The strength of an ecosystem is dependent upon diversity within it. The second, the law of interdependence, that all species within an ecosystem are interdependent with each other. The third, the law of finite resources, a limit to growth, a limit to carrying capacity. And when one species steals the carrying capacity of other species, that causes diminishment in both diversity and interdependence, and that leads towards ecological collapse. And that is what's happening right now. How do we stop that? I don't know. I do know, though, that we have to make some serious decisions on, especially in the ocean. At COP21, I spoke on the ocean thing, and people asked what could be done. I said, okay, the first thing to do to save the ocean is do nothing. And what I mean by that, shut it all down. No more mechanized fishing. Just leave it alone. The ocean is very resilient and it can recover. We just have to leave it alone. But there's 4 million fishing boats out there right now, highly mechanized, super trawlers, or purse seiners, all, and they are strip mining life from the ocean. It hasn't changed. In fact, it's escalated since COP21. And the problem with these climate change conferences is it's all like, let's have another one next year and talk about it because it's really serious. But nothing ever gets done. Every single thing that is put forward is just sort of ignored. A lot of promises, but promises are just promises. There's a lack of political and economic will to actually do anything. And politically, it's political suicide. Any politician who's going to come out and actually do something is going to be voted out of office or thrown out of office, because that would be too damaging to the socio-economic system. So it's a very, very difficult thing to deal with, but it will be solved because nature bats last, and nature will respond. And we're seeing it right now in zoonotic transmitted diseases. There's pathogens being released from permafrost. We're seeing, more and more starvation, famine, all sorts of things that are happening, destruction of coral reefs. It's all happening all around us. But it's not as exciting, I guess, as what's on Netflix.
Thank you. Julian?
Yeah, the point that I'd like to make is that all 10 of the mega threats are intimately connected with one another. You cannot solve one of them without trying to solve all of them. You can't solve them one by one. You can't solve them one at a time. You can't just fix the oceans or fix the climate or something like that and hope that that's going to do it. It's not. We have to solve all of them together. Now, Steve, you keep asking, when is it all going to hit? Well, basically, the answer to that is we don't know, because we don't know when the next big drought is going to occur. The weather and the climate are still fundamentally very hard to predict. But I think that the emergency is first going to impinge on the human consciousness when we run into a severe food crisis, right? Everybody takes their food for granted because the supermarkets are full and things like that. But when a real food crisis hits, we know from COVID that food chains worldwide break down very, very fast in a matter of days. No big city on earth can feed itself, right? If those food chains break down, you will see cities of 20 million people starving by the end of the week. Okay, and that is going to wake people up with a horrid start. So if you just look at the climate patterns, basically you're going to get bigger and bigger impacts as we move towards the middle of the century. We move past 2 degrees plus, and we move towards 3 degrees, where agriculture actually becomes very, very hard to do. So, you're going to see bigger and bigger food crises. Some of them are regional, but, food is all connected around the planet now. I mean, the Chicago Grain Exchange reflects the world price of grain. If there's a dire shortage of grain in Ukraine or in Kazakhstan or somewhere like that, everybody pays a higher price for bread because everybody's bread price goes up. So we cannot be insulated from these things any longer. So my prediction is that the way ordinary people are going to feel this first is in their supermarket trolley. The food they wanted is not going to be available, or it's going to be very, very, very expensive. Now, I can't predict when Vladimir Putin is going to push the button, but if he pushed the button, there would be a nuclear winter, and that would kill 2 billion people in America, China, everywhere else, just simply from the instant chilling of the world climate. So, that would be a very bad thing. So, you can't predict when a nuclear war is going to start. You can't predict when a major drought is going to strike one of the world's grain bowls. But you can anticipate it and you can prepare for it. Now, to me, the good news is that every single one of these problems has got solutions. We know what the answers are. They are well known to people in science and technology. They're well known to farmers and others. We can deal with them. It's just that solutions are not being implemented because, as you say, governments are relaxed. The public is relaxed. Nobody's panicking about the food price any longer. But wait until that food alarm bell rings, and you will see a whole change in human attitudes. Now, the food bell is ringing in Africa, no doubt about that. It's ringing in Central America. It's ringing in quite a few other places. Northern India is starting to look very, very dicey. The North China Plain is running out of water, and that grows most of the Chinese wheat crop. So these kind of places that are utterly vulnerable and where a local crisis could become a global crisis very easily, as people would spill out of those areas and go looking for safety. At the moment, 1/3 of a billion human beings are on the road every single year looking for a safer place to live. E.g. the United States, Australia, Canada, the European Union, etc., etc. So that's 100 million refugees and about 250 million economic migrants who just know that Mumbai is not going to be a safe place to live in future. So we've got to move. So people are already on the move. When that rises to 1 billion people, when national borders crumble under the weight of human migration, then you are going to again get a very big wake-up call, because people will be demanding that their governments stop the refugee influx, but they won't be able to. It'll be a flood. It'll be a tsunami. So, again, that's what you'll see. But that will be the wake-up call. I think food and a migrant tsunami. But when it's going to happen, I don't have a crystal ball.
But just one quick thing. If a nuclear bomb is dropped, you're saying 2 billion people would die from that?
Well, that's what the modeling says. Basically, what happens if you use, say, 50 to 100 nukes, you would throw up enough smoke and dust to chill the Earth by around about 2 degrees temporarily for about 10 to 20 years. And this is what Robock and Toon and people like that at the University of Colorado have been working on this. And if you do that, you get massive crop failures. You get winter kill in most of the big world grain growing areas. And so, even places which are relatively food secure, like North America, will suffer, huge harvest losses. China will suffer major losses to both wheat and rice crops and things like that. So, a nuclear war is very, very bad for everybody. The problem we have at the moment is that there are people in Russia, America, China, and so on who think you can have a small nuclear war, and just fire a few of these things to discourage the opposition. It's not that simple.
Okay, so if we said that we had, if JFK Jr. becomes president of the United States, he's an environmentalist, and he named the 4 of you to run the country for him, and people were willing to do whatever it takes. What are the most powerful actions that a human could take? And then what would the government need to do? So, what's the very, very most powerful thing? I'm not asking whether it's realistic that we could get this level of cooperation. I'm just saying, if someone said everyone will do anything it takes to solve these problems, what would be the most powerful action that we could take individually, and then that we could get our government to take?
Well, I think that it needs a real paradigm shift here. That one of the problems I think that we have is that we live in a very anthropocentric culture. The whole planet is anthropocentric. That means it's all about us. We're the only species that matter. It was even created for us. That's how delusional this is. Every single major religion on this planet puts human beings as in the center and all important, and everything else is insignificant. When the reality is that we are part of everything else. And if the bees disappear, the worms disappear, the fish disappear, we're in serious trouble. They're more important than we are because they don't need us, but we need them. And we're destroying them. I like to compare it this way. If you imagine the planet as a spaceship, which is what it is, and it's on this incredible voyage around the Milky Way galaxy, and that spaceship has a life support system which is run by a crew of engineers. And those engineers keep everything running. They provide the food we eat, regulate climate and temperature, and what are we doing, we human beings? We're passengers. We're having a wonderful time entertaining ourselves, but we're murdering engineers. We're killing them off every day. And there's only so many engineers you can kill before the machinery begins to fall apart and break down, and the passengers go down with the ship along with the crew. And that's really the situation we're having now. So we have to learn to live in harmony and with deep respect for all other species on this planet, or we're not going to survive.
Understand that this question is not a realistic question based on what you're saying, but if somehow if someone said, I'm willing to do, if 8 billion people were willing to do anything, just tell me what would actually work to fix the oceans, the atmosphere, the soil, the food, the water. What would it take, even if it's not realistic?
Sorry, you go ahead.
Well, just offer a couple of thoughts. First of all, a ban on all fossil fuels would solve two of the mega threats. It would solve the climate one, and it would also solve global poisoning, because most fossil fuels are turned into the chemicals that poison us, or a lot of fossil fuels are these days. But the second one that could actually really make a difference is what I term renewable food. If we completely rethink the world food system, so we are much less reliant on agriculture, which is a Bronze Age technology for farming, for producing food, and we use other systems such as urban systems which recycle nutrients and water and don't require vast areas of land and water to do, and they're climate proof, or deep ocean aquaculture. If you did this, you could actually get rid of 2/3, or you could turn half of the world's farmed and grazing area back to nature, and you could end commercial fishing of the oceans. And that would put us on a much more sustainable pathway. So just two things: ban fossil fuels and renewable food are my short answers to what your president would do. But having said that, of course, nations are well past their use-by date. No nation is going to solve this problem. We have to solve it as one people on one planet, else it won't get solved. So there's a bit of a difficulty there.
David, Anne, any specific solutions? Like what would be the solutions that would work, even if they're not realistic, that people would do it?
I have a quick unrealistic one for you, Steve. And that is, what if we put people like Greta Thunberg and other young people in charge, some of whom are very clear-eyed about the kind of future that they will be living in. And she can do, we'll put JFK Jr. aside for a moment, because let's just say Greta's going to be determining things. I've seen young people say and do things that tell me that they see and they know what needs to be done. And so I say, let's put them in charge, and they can start tweaking these levers and these dials and getting things lined up so that, as Paul had said earlier, when he made his comment about the ocean being resilient, I think human populations in the natural world are resilient as well, but we need to back off and let that resiliency start chugging away. And I think that would be a way to get that done.
So assume that Greta was in charge and she came to you and she said, okay, tell me exactly what I could do that would have the greatest impact, and assume everyone would listen. What would you tell her to do?
Well, she has some pretty firm ideas about that. And, one of them is, a few of them have been alluded to or directly mentioned here about getting off of fossil fuels completely, lowering, the consumption level, especially on the part of Western nations in terms of all of the material items and possessions that we as consumers are offered and that we purchase and so on. So I would, in some ways, Steve, leave it to her to follow through on things.
Okay.
Well, I wouldn't presume to give her advice except on one thing. If she pursues that, she should get a bulletproof vest, because that's the problem. If you are a threat to this society, they will take you out one way or the other.
Could I supplement what Anne just said? Because I think this is the absolute key to this. Not just young people, but women. We should put women in charge of the world. Why? Because of almost all the wars in human history, they've all been started by men. Who likes fighting? Men. Who invents toxic chemistry? Men. Who invents new weapons? Men. Men are responsible for most of the destruction. We are simple, thuggish warrior beasts at heart. And we had a wonderful solution for the Middle Ages or caveman era, but it's not going to be a solution when our survival is delicately balanced on the planet. Women tend to think a generation or two ahead. They think of the grandkids and so forth. They have already reduced their fertility from 4.5 children down to 2.4 babies per woman over the last 40 years or so. So they're already getting control of the one issue that is actually driving all of these problems, which is human overpopulation. So women have come up with a response, and they didn't ask men whether they should do this or not. They just got on and did it. Women are the natural leaders of this planet in the 21st century in every sphere of life. So I'm talking about commerce, government, religion, community, you name it. Women should be in charge. Maybe not a huge majority, but at least a majority. I'm not saying women are perfect, they're far from it, but they definitely have a more peaceful and a more negotiatory view of the world than men, who just like to kill things. And our solution, male solutions, is always let's kill it. If we don't like it, let's kill it. Whether it's an insect or the next door country, it doesn't really matter. So if humans as a species are going to survive, they need to change their thinking, and men need to think a lot more like women, a lot more like Greta Thunberg and others, or Jane Fonda, or anybody you care to name. But if women aren't in charge, we've got a very grim future.
Well, we always have a Maggie Thatcher, though. Yeah, there are exceptions.
Well, Maggie Thatcher did not start the war, you remember. She wasn't an exception. She was attacked by a bunch of men in Argentina. And so, there are women who have fought as warriors, and nobody's denying that women have as much courage as men when they're warriors. Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, there's lots of examples of women leaders who've led their countries in war, but nearly always have they been the victims who've been attacked by somebody else. So, if you look at the lesson of history, is that women don't start wars. In the last 200 years, all of the wars have been started either by male monarchs or male governments, male-dominated governments, all of them. So women did not ask for this, and they don't want it by and large. If you ask women, whether they want war or not, they'll say no. But a proportion of men will always, think it's romantic.
David, did you want to comment on that question about the solutions?
Yeah, I think I do. I'm deeply skeptical of putting any one individual in charge of anything. I think that a lot of our power as a species involves our ability to bounce ideas around each other, to change our mind when we had a bad idea and we encounter a better idea. So I would be not in favor of the enlightened monarch scenario, even if it was Greta Thunberg. And I do agree that I think on average, if women were running the planet, things would probably be a little better than they are now for many of the reasons that have been expressed, although I might quibble with a few of those points. The thing that has been really not mentioned so far, but that I think is actually a really important lever that we have for ensuring a better future, is the idea of, which touches on some of the things that have been said, is the idea of fundamentally rethinking our relationship with the soil in agriculture so that we can turn farms into areas that are building and promoting biodiversity rather than degrading biodiversity, building fertile soils rather than degrading fertile soils, and nourishing the world rather than just attempting to keep up with calories to feed the world. And I think we know the basics of the science of what it would take to do that. People still quibble about how much carbon we could pull from the atmosphere and put into soils through agricultural techniques. But the bottom line is, the answer is a lot. It may not solve the climate crisis, but it can contribute greatly towards doing so. So the idea of eliminating the use of fossil fuels, we basically need to leave as much of them in the ground as we can possibly get away with. And I think that the key to a transition that could help with both the climate and the soils issue, and I haven't thought too hard about how this would apply to the oceans yet, is attempting to basically align our economic subsidies and incentives at national and international levels with directions and activities that actually enhance environmental characteristics, enhance the fertility of the land. And I've become very encouraged about that in the soil arena, because the basic methods and techniques that farmers can use to engage in regenerative farming practices are the same ones that can reduce their use of fossil fuels, reduce their reliance on agrochemicals, pesticides, and nitrogen-based fertilizers, which are derived from fossil fuels. And they can be more profitable, and they can actually even lower the price of food if enough people were doing that. The marginal cost of production in regenerative systems is actually, the ones I've interviewed farmers on, is actually lower than the marginal cost in conventional systems. They can actually get a premium because they're growing better food, so the cost may be higher, but if everyone was doing it, that market signal would basically disappear. So I think that, if you put me in charge, which I do not recommend, because I don't recommend putting anyone in charge. But if you put me in charge, the first thing I would try and do is basically reshape our agricultural system around the subsidies and incentives that we give farmers to basically destroy the land as a consequence of their farming practices, rather than rewarding them for adopting new practices, which can enhance the biodiversity, fertility, and productivity of land, but that requires not only a change in practices, but a deep change in thinking along the lines of what Paul was arguing for earlier, in terms of how we view nature as partners that we cultivate rather than as enemies that we compete with.
Do you think that it would be helpful if the whole world adopted a whole food plant-based diet? And should we allow fishing at all?
Well, in my opinion, we got to wipe out mechanized industrialized fishing completely. Also, you need to eliminate factory farms. 80 billion animals a year being killed, a major contributor to groundwater pollution, the major contributor to dead zones in the ocean, a major contributor to greenhouse gases, and also a major source of zoonotic transmitted viruses. That's why they're killing millions of animals every year, to keep a lid on that petri dish, which are these factory farms. They have to be shut down.
Yeah, I would basically argue that we do not need to go to an entirely plant-based diet, but I agree with what Paul has just said in terms of needing to shut down the kinds of fisheries that are depleting the oceans, and the kinds of agriculture that are depleting our soils and that are raising animals in environments they did not evolve to be in, and that produce foods that are not ideal for us to eat either. And if you're curious about details on that, Anne and I wrote a lot about that in What Your Food Ate. But there are examples of sustainable fisheries. The Native American fishery in the Northwest was sustained for 9,000 years on the Columbia River. The key to it was they were not doing things the way we do them. They were doing it in ways that was a terminal fishery on the river mouths or in the rivers when the fish came back. They were not doing open ocean fishing. They were only taking, the best estimates are they were taking 20% of the runs. And if you talk to most salmon biologists today, they'll argue that if you have habitat availability, salmon populations can withstand a human predation of just under 50% and reseed themselves. So they can be a sustainable resource if we manage ourselves, if we manage our fishing practices in a way that respects the resource. And agriculture is pretty similar. And when you look at the arguments for a plant-based diet, for example, the first thing that one should ask is, how are those plants raised? Because the point I made in the book I first wrote about agriculture, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, was that societies in the past that were organic and not mechanized destroyed their land by over-farming it in ways that we're still doing with conventional methods. We're just doing it faster and more efficiently. So the question in terms of what to eat and what we should be growing, I think the first question we need to ask is, how are we actually doing it? Because there are certain environments around the world, many of them semi-arid grasslands, for example, that are ideal grazing lands where livestock can do things on that land to convert grasses that we cannot eat and digest into meat and milk that can help support human populations. But that style of sort of open range grazing is really different from the factory farms where we're feeding animals corn-derived products that are raised using agricultural methods that destroy the soil the corn was grown in. There's a whole causal chain in the industrialized version of animal husbandry that really does need to change for a sustainable future. But it's not so much that we don't need to ever eat meat or don't ever need to eat fish in a sustainable future. We just have to fundamentally rethink how we raise and acquire all of them.
Well, 40% of the fish caught from the ocean commercially is turned into fish meal to be fed to animals on factory farms. So that's another problem. But also, the Basque and the Bretons, they were fishing the Grand Banks in Newfoundland for 300 years without any impact. And then within a couple of decades, you see the draggers go in there and just wipe out everything.
Well, I think there's a huge difference between just, what David described going on in the mouth of the Columbia River, and Paul, what you just said. So when you have a regional or a local population that's relying on, say, a fish food source, that is really different than a multinational global corporation coming to a few areas and fishing for profit. That's just, it's totally different. And I think in some ways we have gotten ourselves into a bind, whether it's with fisheries or food grown on land, in that we grow it and then we want to transport it vast distances instead of looking at local and regional populations being the consumers of the food or the fish in the places where they live. That's not the modern world, I get that. But if we could somehow take this pressure off of the oceans and off of the land, it will, I think, improve people's health and the human diet and the environment at the same time.
Steve, I'd like to make the point that there are enough nutrients flowing through New York City to feed New York City. At the moment, a third of its food is being thrown into landfill and the rest of it is going down the sewer pipe. And if those nutrients were harvested, you could feed New York sustainably and climate-proof way without impacting on the wider landscape thousands of miles away. That applies to every city on Earth. If we rethink the food system around nutrient flows, then we can really make a difference. Now, if you want to get rid of fishing in the oceans, the easy way to do that is to actually start farming the deep oceans, extracting the nutrients that humans already put in the deep oceans from all the erosion on land, and all our sewage and things like that, which has gone to the bottom of the sea. But you can extract nutrients from the water column in the deep ocean, and you can use them to grow sea crops. And you can use the sea crops then to feed fish in extensive fish farms, not these horrid intensive nets that they're using now. If you do that, you don't need to do any mechanized fishing or wild harvest fishing at all. Because a sea farm is a three-dimensional thing. For a kilometre of sea will produce 10 times the amount of food that the square kilometre of land will produce. So deep ocean aquaculture is one way of taking the pressure off the rest of the planet. It may have drawbacks itself, but it doesn't pollute, unlike coastal aquaculture. And you are starting to recycle and use again the nutrients that humans have already wasted, which is a very important point. So if we can build these nutrient cycles, our cities can feed themselves. I want to make one more point. We currently eat 300 different plants. There are 30,000 edible plants on planet Earth. So we haven't even begun to explore the biological and culinary richness of our own environment. We haven't discovered all these wonderful new foods. Most of our native peoples know about them, but we don't, as an industrial society. So there's huge opportunities to grow new types of food on regenerative farms, and in aquaponic and hydroponic setups in cities and things like that. So a renewable food supply is going to revolutionize how we go about these things in a way that renewable energy isn't. This is going to be bigger, 3-4 times bigger than renewable energy. And renewable energy's already got ahead of steam. So renewable food, take it from me, is a thing that can really make the difference, and people are going to love it. And it's going to make a huge difference to our health, because we'll be eating healthy, fresh food that is not soused in chemicals.